In the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union presented its air arm as a symbol of rapid industrialization and technological progress. The Workers' and Peasants' Red Air Fleet, usually called the VVS, expanded alongside the Red Army and received investments in aircraft plants, training schools, and research institutes. Celebrations highlighted record flights over the Arctic and long-range routes, and foreign observers noted that by 1936, the Soviet Union possessed one of the largest air forces in Europe in terms of aircraft and trained crews. Behind these images, the VVS was still defining its doctrine. Senior commanders such as Yakov Alksnis, appointed head of the Air Force in 1931, promoted mass aviation, centralized control, and close integration with ground forces. They oversaw the development of bomber and fighter formations and supported specialized academies for pilots, navigators, and engineers. Many officers had limited combat experience, but a group of volunteers would soon acquire it in the skies over Spain. The international environment reinforced the belief that air power would be decisive in any future war. The Nazi regime in Germany rearmed after 1933, building the Luftwaffe and conducting maneuvers that emphasized fast armored and air formations. In Asia, Japan used land-based aircraft and carrier aviation in operations over China. Western military journals discussed the possibility of bombing campaigns against cities and industries. Soviet planners, watching these developments, expected that any conflict in Europe would begin with intensive air operations against airfields, command posts, and transport hubs. By the middle of the decade, the VVS command was organized in a hierarchical structure linked to military districts. At the top stood the Air Force's Directorate under the People's Commissariat of Defense, headed by a commander and deputies for operations, training, and logistics. Below them, air armies and aviation corps supported combined arms armies and front commands. Fighter, bomber, and reconnaissance regiments were subordinated to these formations, while training schools and technical units remained under central control. This structure assumed continuity of leadership and gradual professionalization. The internal political context moved in a different direction. From 1936 to 1938, the Great Purge reshaped the Soviet elite. The NKVD targeted party officials, economic managers, and military officers on charges that ranged from espionage to participation in alleged conspiracies. In the armed forces, archival research indicates that 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and many corps and division commanders were arrested, dismissed, or executed. The Air Force did not escape. More than 3/4 of its senior officers were arrested, executed, or removed from their posts. For the aviation sector, repression extended beyond uniformed officers. In 1938 alone, the head of the VVS, Yakov Alksnis, was executed, and approximately 400 to 500 aero engineers in the Commissariat of Aviation Industry were arrested. Around 70 were shot, and about 100 died in labor camps. Design bureaus and factories lost experienced specialists who had worked on engine development and airframe production. These arrests coincided with the introduction of new aircraft types, engines, and weapons. The leadership expected a transition from earlier biplane fighters and light bombers to newer monoplanes with higher speeds and better armament. Training programs were supposed to produce growing numbers of pilots capable of flying in formation, navigating in bad weather, and using modern radio equipment. Instead, frequent changes in command and the disappearance of instructors disrupted continuity in doctrine and practice. Within the officer corps, the purges created mixed reactions. Some commanders saw the arrests as acts of state security and adapted to the new conditions, focusing on technical tasks and avoiding political discussion. Others experienced a climate of uncertainty in which professional errors, accidents, or even association with arrested colleagues could lead to investigation. Many officers concentrated on meeting production and training targets, sometimes at the expense of analysis of tactics and equipment. Foreign military attachés and intelligence services tried to interpret these developments with limited information. German, British, and Japanese observers received reports about changes in Soviet command lists and gaps in public appearances by senior officers, but they lacked precise figures. Some analysts concluded that the Red Army and VVS had been weakened, while others argued that the Soviet regime had replaced older cadres with younger officers who would learn on the job. On the eve of war in 1941, the extent of disruption inside Soviet aviation remained unclear, including for many officers who saw only the effects within their own units. When the Civil War erupted in Spain in 1936, Soviet leaders regarded it as both an ideological contest and a practical test ground for their armed forces. The VVS sent volunteer pilots, technicians and staff officers under conditions of secrecy. Over the course of the conflict, approximately 770 Soviet aviation personnel served in Spain, flying more than 600 aircraft delivered to the Spanish Republic, including I-15 and I-16 fighters and SB bombers. Their task was to defend cities, escort bombers, and support ground operations against German and Italian-supported forces. For the airmen, Spain provided the first sustained modern air combat experience. Pilots such as Yakov Smushkevich, operating under the pseudonym General Douglas, and younger officers like Pavel Rychagov accumulated dozens of sorties and engaged German Legion Condor fighters and bombers. They experimented with tactics for escorts, coordinated attacks on bomber formations, and low-level strikes against airfields and transport nodes. Reports from Spain influenced discussions in Moscow about formation flying, radio discipline, and the balance between fighter and bomber production. Within the VVS command structure, veterans of Spain were seen initially as a valuable resource. They were assigned to staff positions, training establishments, and regimental commands. Smushkevich rose rapidly. By 1939, he would become commander of the air forces of the Red Army. Other returnees taught at academies, wrote tactical manuals, and briefed senior leaders on German and Italian methods. The expectation was that these officers, combining political reliability with combat experience, would form the core of a more professional air arm. At the same time, the domestic political climate inside the Soviet Union hardened. The first major public trial of high-ranking army officers in June 1937, which included Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and several commanders, signaled that the Purge had reached the military. NKVD organs established special departments within military districts and branches, tasked with uncovering alleged conspiracies. Officers were required to submit detailed autobiographies, describe foreign contacts, and comment on colleagues. Service abroad, including in Spain, drew particular attention. The opening phase of the Air Force Purge took shape through a combination of investigations, arrests, and reassignments. In mid-1937, staff officers in the Air Force's Directorate were questioned about their links to commanders already under suspicion. Some were removed from posts without public explanation and replaced with younger officers whose main qualification was loyalty as defined by party organs. By the end of the year, former associates of Auxnes and other senior commanders appeared in NKVD arrest lists as participants in supposed military conspiracies or foreign espionage networks. This process unfolded unevenly across units. Some regiments experienced rapid turnover in leadership as commanders were arrested or dismissed, while others retained their officers but operated under constant political scrutiny. Party meetings in aviation units discussed resolutions on vigilance, self-criticism, and the need to expose enemies within the ranks. Political departments instructed officers to denounce rotten liberalism towards suspected colleagues. The boundary between professional disagreement, error in training or accidents, and alleged disloyalty became blurred. For the officers who had flown in Spain, the transition from celebrated combatants to potential suspects could be abrupt. decoration for service abroad did not guarantee security. In 1937 and 1938, some Spanish Civil War veterans were promoted, while others were arrested on their return or after short periods in new appointments. The same combat reports that had showcased their initiative were sometimes reinterpreted as evidence of independent thinking, foreign influence, or contact with foreign officers beyond authorized channels. Foreign intelligence services observed fragments of this process. German and Italian analysts tracked the appearance and disappearance of Soviet commanders in public sources and tried to infer internal struggles. Some concluded that the Soviet Union was eliminating officers with Western combat experience, weakening its air arm. Others assumed that the purges were limited or that new cadres would quickly fill the gaps. Within the Soviet Union, the immediate operational impact was still difficult to measure. Aircraft numbers continued to grow on paper, training schools continued to graduate pilots, and official statements emphasized the strength of the VVS. By 1938, however, the pattern of arrests at higher levels of command indicated that the opening phase of the Purge had become a structural factor in the life of the Air Force. The combination of secrecy, incomplete information, and the broad mandate of the security organs meant that any officer could be investigated. This environment would shape the further evolution of the VVS leadership in the final years before the German invasion. Strategic planning for Soviet aviation in the late 1930s took shape at the intersection of industrial policy, military doctrine, and internal security concerns. The third five-year plan, launched in 1938, called for a sharp increase in aircraft production, higher engine output, and the introduction of new fighter and bomber types. Aviation plants in Moscow, Leningrad, Kharkov, and other centers received targets that envisaged several thousand aircraft per year, while new facilities were constructed in the Volga and Ural regions to reduce vulnerability to a potential Western invasion. Within the VVS command, the primary goal was to translate these industrial targets into an effective force structure. Planners in the Air Force's Directorate proposed a balance between fighter, bomber, and reconnaissance regiments, with particular attention to long-range bombers and fast twin-engine aircraft that could strike rail nodes and concentrations of enemy troops. Training departments drafted programs to expand the annual output of pilots, navigators, and ground technicians, aiming to match the expected growth in units deployed with military districts and fronts. At the same time, the political leadership defined its own priorities for the Air Force. For Stalin and the senior party leadership, aviation was both a military instrument and a symbol of the regime. It needed to demonstrate technological modernity and political reliability. The Purge reshaped the criteria for promotion. Emphasis shifted from length of service and technical skill to political characteristics, as assessed by party committees and NKVD reports. Officers were expected to show initiative in training and operations while strictly following decisions from above, a combination that could generate tensions in practice. This dual logic influenced the reorganization of the command structure between 1938 and 1940. Posts held in 1936 by men like Alksnis and his circle were filled by new appointees, many in their 30s, who had risen quickly during the Purge. By 1940, the list of commanders of air forces in military districts and separate armies had changed almost completely compared with 4 years earlier. Some of the new leaders, including Smushkevich, had combat experience in Spain or at Khalkhin Gol against Japanese forces in 1939, but many others came from staff or training roles and were still forming their views on air operations. Doctrinal documents reflected these shifts. Field regulations and instructions issued in 1936 and revised in 1939 described air power primarily as a means to support offensive operations of combined arms fronts. They emphasized massed attacks against enemy groupings, disruption of reserves, and protection of own troops from hostile aircraft. Less attention was paid to independent strategic bombing or to flexible, decentralized fighter control. The experience of Spain and border conflicts was incorporated selectively, often filtered through political assessments of allies and adversaries. Planning for war also required assumptions about potential opponents. Soviet intelligence followed German rearmament and the growth of the Luftwaffe, estimating numbers of aircraft, unit locations, and training standards. These estimates informed calculations about how many regiments the VVS would need to deploy in the Western military districts, what proportion should be equipped with the newest fighters, such as the projected MiG and Yak designs, and how quickly older types would be withdrawn. The gap between these plans and actual production, however, remained significant. Logistically, the expansion of the Air Force posed further challenges. Airfields had to be lengthened or newly constructed to accommodate heavier and faster aircraft. Fuel storage, bomb depots and maintenance workshops needed to be built at bases close to the state border and in depth. Communications networks using telephone, telegraph and radio had to link air units with ground commands. In practice, construction lagged behind planning, and many regiments trained on grass strips with limited navigation aids and rudimentary repair facilities. The Purge interacted with these processes by repeatedly interrupting continuity. When a regimental or district air commander was arrested or transferred, his replacement often changed training priorities, reorganized staff, and altered the implementation of central directives. Planning documents might remain formally in force, but their application varied by unit and district. As a result, on the eve of the Second World War, the VVS presented a paradoxical picture. Ambitious plans for modernization and mass production coexisted with unstable leadership, incomplete infrastructure, and ongoing scrutiny by security organs that shaped decisions at every level. The first major tests of the restructured VVS came not against Germany, but on remote frontiers. In 1938 and 1939, clashes with Japan along the Manchurian border forced Soviet aviation to operate under wartime conditions. At Khalkhin-Gol in summer 1939, Soviet forces under Georgy Zhukov concentrated at least 301 aircraft by late June, including about 95 the Th-16 monoplanes, 56 Mir-15 biplane fighters, and 135 SB bombers. During the campaign, Soviet aviation flew more than 18,000 fighter sorties and about 2,000 bomber sorties, dropping around 1,200 tons of bombs. These operations demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of the reorganized air arm. On one hand, the VVS achieved local air superiority over Japanese units that fielded fewer than 200 aircraft in the theatre. Soviet reports credited massed fighter formations and concentrated bomber strikes with supporting the encirclement of Japanese ground forces. On the other hand, the statistics of losses showed the costs of this approach. Soviet combat losses amounted to approximately 163 fighters, 44 bombers and 1 reconnaissance aircraft, with 174 aircrew killed and 113 wounded, while Japanese air forces lost about 97 fighters, 25 bombers, and 41 other types in combat. The ratio suggested that Soviet tactics achieved results, but at high expenditure of machines and crews, reflecting dense formations and relatively rigid mission planning. For officers in Moscow, Khalkhin-Gol provided data on the performance of pilots promoted during the Purge. Some unit commanders who had risen rapidly under the new political criteria proved capable of coordinating large-scale operations. Others struggled with navigation, logistics, and cooperation with ground units. Technical defects in engines and weapons, linked to the earlier arrests of engineers and managers in the aviation industry, appeared in the form of breakdowns and maintenance delays. Yet the overall result, a successful defense of Mongolia and a negotiated end to the conflict, reinforced official claims that the leadership changes had not weakened combat capability. Only a few months later, the Winter War against Finland opened a different kind of air campaign. When the Soviet Union attacked on 30 November 1939, it deployed roughly 2,300 to 2,500 aircraft against a Finnish air force of about 100 to 120 operational machines. The Soviet inventory included I-15, I-153 and I-116 fighters, SB and DB-3 bombers and TB-3 heavy bombers. The initial plan envisaged using air power to disrupt Finnish mobilization, destroy transport hubs, and support ground offensives along the Karelian Isthmus and in central Finland. In practice, the first weeks of operations exposed shortcomings in navigation, bombing accuracy, and coordination. Many targets in Finland were small rail junctions, depots and bridges in forested terrain. Crews trained mainly for scheduled flights over familiar routes found it difficult to identify objectives in winter conditions with limited daylight. Contemporary studies suggest that Soviet aviation flew around 44,000 sorties during the war and lost between 400 and 900 aircraft from all causes, while Finnish forces lost between 60 and 140 aircraft. Finnish anti-aircraft units and a small fighter force inflicted a disproportionate share of combat losses, while weather and operational accidents claimed many additional Soviet machines. For Finnish civilians and soldiers, the experience of Soviet air attacks ranged from destructive raids on cities such as Viipuri and Helsinki to repeated bombing of rail lines that were quickly repaired. For Soviet air crews, the campaign meant operating from improvised airfields in severe winter, often with inadequate ground support and limited feedback on bombing results. Commanders attempted to adjust tactics by shifting toward more battlefield-oriented support missions in early 1940. But these changes took time to implement. The contrast with German experience in Poland in September 1939 provided an external reference point. In that campaign, the Luftwaffe committed almost 2,000 aircraft to support 66 German divisions and 6 brigades, while Poland fielded roughly 400 to 450 aircraft. Germany had about 2,315 aircraft in total, available for the theatre, and the Soviet Union, which entered eastern Poland on September 17th, possessed around 3,300 aircraft on paper. German doctrine emphasized close coordination between air and fast ground units, rapid destruction of enemy air forces on the ground, and interdiction of reserves. Polish observers and later historians noted that German air power often struck airfields and columns at decisive moments in the ground battle. Soviet analysts had access to some information about Luftwaffe performance through reports and intelligence summaries. Comparing it with their own experience in Finland and at Khalkhin Gol, they faced a mixed picture. The VVS could concentrate large numbers of aircraft and achieve local air superiority. But command structures and training had not yet produced the same level of flexible, combined arms coordination seen in German operations. At the same time, the poor performance of some ground units in the Winter War led to criticism of the army, rather than systematic reconsideration of air doctrine. Within the VVS, the first campaigns after the Purge had different effects on morale. Success at Khalkhin Gol and the eventual breakthrough of Finnish defences encouraged the view that the restructured leadership could learn under fire. Yet high aircraft losses, frequent accidents, and visible deficiencies in equipment also generated private doubts among pilots and technicians. These contradictions would carry over into the next phase, when the Air Force had to prepare for the possibility of a large-scale conflict in Europe in which it could face the Luftwaffe directly. The escalation phase of the Air Force purge unfolded against the background of a rapidly widening European war. After the German invasion of Poland in September 1939 and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union occupied eastern Poland, then incorporated the Baltic states in 1940 and took Bessarabia from Romania. Each territorial change required redeployment of aviation units. Regiments were moved into newly acquired areas, often to airfields that were still under construction, with limited hardened runways, fuel storage, and maintenance facilities. On paper, the VVS expanded. In practice, the transition raised accident rates and stretched training and logistics. By mid-1940, the Soviet armed forces were growing toward a peacetime establishment that would place about 476,000 personnel in the Air Force and roughly 20,474 combat aircraft in service by June 1941. Many of these machines remained older I-15, I-153, and I-16 fighters and SB and DB bombers, though new MiG, Yak, and Laj-G fighters and P-2 bombers were entering production. In the western military districts alone, Soviet records indicate a concentration of approximately 10,451 combat aircraft, facing about 3,297 German combat aircraft assigned to Operation Barbarossa, a numerical ratio of more than 3-1. These figures suggested strength, yet behind them lay a crisis of command and reliability. Accidents became a central indicator for both military and political leaders. Frequent crashes during training flights, ferry missions to new airfields, and long-distance redeployments alarmed the Politburo. In October 1940, the NKVD began a new purge that initially focused on the People's Commissariats of Ammunition, Aviation Industry and Armaments, investigating production faults and alleged sabotage in factories. High-level officials confessed under interrogation and named subordinates, extending the circle of arrests in aviation design bureaus, engine plants and supply organizations. Technical problems in aircraft and engines were thus interpreted not only as industrial shortcomings, but as potential evidence of political disloyalty. The Air Force leadership came under direct scrutiny in 1940 to 1941. After Alksness had been arrested in 1937 and executed in 1940, his successors as heads of the Air Force followed a similar path. Alexander Loktionov, Yakov Smushkevich, and later Pavel Rychagov each occupied the post for a short period before being removed and eventually repressed. In April-May 1941, a Politburo inquiry into the high accident rate in the VVS led to the dismissal of Rychagov as commander of the Air Force and other senior officers. During one meeting, sources report that Rychagov described some existing aircraft as flying coffins, a remark that was later cited against him as evidence of disloyalty rather than as criticism of design and maintenance standards. A separate incident accelerated the crisis. In May 1941, a German Junkers Ju-52 transport flew into Soviet airspace and landed near Moscow without being intercepted by air defense units, exposing weaknesses in radar coverage, communications, and fighter readiness. The failure to detect and prevent this landing prompted a series of investigations and arrests in the air defense and Air Force command structures. Within weeks, NKVD organs arrested senior officers who had previously held key posts in aviation, often linking them to alleged conspiracies dating back to the 1937 to 1938 trials. Between late May and late June 1941, while German forces completed their deployment along the frontier, arrests affected a wide circle of leaders connected with the air arm. Among those detained were Lieutenant General Pyotr Pumpur, former commander of long-range aviation, Colonel General Grigory Stern, who had commanded forces in the Far East, Lieutenant General Yakov Smushkevich, former head of the Air Force, Lieutenant General Pavel Alexeyev, Colonel General Alexander Loktionov, and shortly after the German invasion, Lieutenant General Pavel Rychagov himself. Many of these officers had experience from Spain, Khalkhin-Gol, or other conflicts abroad. Their removal took place just as units under their former authority were preparing for possible hostilities. For officers and pilots at regimental level, this escalation created a climate of uncertainty. Commanders could be promoted rapidly, then disappear without public explanation, to be replaced by colleagues who had to familiarize themselves with their new units under time pressure. Political departments in aviation formations treated accidents not only as training and technical problems, but as potential signs of negligence or hostile intent. Flight commanders, under orders to increase the number of training hours and ferry missions to forward airfields, had to balance safety with fulfillment of plans, aware that serious incidents might trigger investigations. Abroad, the combination of purges and battlefield performance shaped perceptions of Soviet capabilities. Foreign observers watched the Winter War and noted Red Army and VVS difficulties, then learned of continuing arrests among Soviet commanders. Studies of decision-making in Berlin indicate that these events contributed to an assessment of the Soviet armed forces as disorganized and poorly led, an assessment that played a role in German planning for a rapid campaign in the East. Inside the Soviet Union, however, the official conclusion drawn from the same sequence was different. Failures were often attributed to insufficient vigilance and discipline, reinforcing the logic of further investigations rather than prompting a reconsideration of how personnel policy and doctrine affected the Air Force's readiness on the eve of war. In June 1941, the air war on the Eastern Front reached its most intense phase in the very first days. When German forces attacked on 22nd June, the Luftwaffe committed roughly 2,800 to 3,000 combat aircraft against the Soviet Union, of which around 2,000 were immediately available in army groups north, center, and south. The Soviet side had in the western border military districts approximately 10,000 to 10,500 combat aircraft, but only a minority were of the newest types, such as MiG-3, Yak-1, and P-2. Most units still operated I-15, I-153, and I-16 fighters and SB and DB bombers with variable levels of serviceability. The German opening plan aimed to destroy Soviet aviation chiefly on the ground. Luftflotten 1, 2 and 4 concentrated bomber and dive bomber groups against airfields, fuel depots and command posts in the Baltic, Belarusian and Ukrainian districts. In the first day alone, German units flew several thousand sorties. Soviet records and German claims differ, but most studies converge on a figure of roughly 1,200 to 1,500 Soviet aircraft destroyed. On 22nd June, the majority on airfields hit during the first hours of the invasion. In some border zones, individual air divisions lost half or more of their aircraft before pilots could take off. For VVS formations, the peak of the crisis came when they tried to improvise under fire. Many regiments received the first warning of war, not from central orders, but from explosions at nearby airfields. Telephone and telegraph links to district headquarters were cut by bombing and ground breakthroughs. Communications between air units and ground commands were often incomplete. Some fighter regiments scrambled without clear information on targets or front lines, climbing to patrol altitude over their bases rather than intercepting enemy bombers at range. Others received orders to shift to reserve airfields that lacked prepared runways or fuel. The leadership structure created by the Purge now faced the most severe test. In the Western Special Military District, soon renamed the Western Front, the Air Force commander and his staff had to reorganize surviving units under conditions of rapid German advance. Similar situations unfolded in the Baltic and Kiev districts. Some newly appointed commanders responded by issuing orders for dispersal of aircraft and construction of dummy airfields, but these measures could not be implemented quickly enough everywhere. In several instances, orders to move were delayed or countermanded as headquarters tried to restore control, leading to congested airfields that became vulnerable targets. On the German side, the first week confirmed expectations formed during planning. Reports from Luftwaffe field commands described numerous Soviet aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, camouflaged poorly or not at all. Intercepted Soviet wireless traffic suggested confusion in command. At the same time, German crews encountered patches of determined resistance. Over some sectors, Soviet pilots flying Abas-16s and MiG-3s engaged German bombers and fighters repeatedly, despite numerical and tactical disadvantages. Loss figures show that the Luftwaffe also suffered. In the first 10 days of the campaign, it lost several hundred aircraft from all causes, including combat, accidents, and mechanical failures, though at a lower rate than the VVS. For Soviet pilots and ground personnel, the peak period combined intense activity with high attrition. Crews flew multiple sorties per day from improvised strips, often without proper maintenance intervals. Ground staff refueled and rearmed aircraft under the threat of renewed raids, sometimes using hand pumps and improvised facilities because fuel trucks and depots had been destroyed or captured. Units that had recently re-equipped with new aircraft types found that pilots lacked sufficient training hours and that spare parts were scarce. In long-range aviation, P2 and DB3 formations attempted strikes on bridges and concentrations behind German lines, but suffered heavy losses to fighters and flak. Civilian populations in the newly invaded territories experienced the air war primarily through bombing of cities, junctions, and roads. Luftwaffe attacks on Minsk, Riga, Kaunas, and other centers aimed to disrupt mobilization and administration. Soviet aviation also conducted raids against German rear areas and East Prussian and Romanian cities, but on a smaller scale and with limited effect. Refugee columns and troop convoys on the roads were exposed to strafing and bombing from both sides at different moments of the advance and retreat. Inside the Soviet command system, the first week produced urgent attempts to stabilize the situation. The General Staff issued orders to withdraw surviving air units eastward, to concentrate them under front commands, and to establish a layered air defense of key industrial regions. In parallel, NKVD representatives reported on supposed failures and acts of cowardice among aviation officers, transmitting lists of names for investigation. The same mechanisms that had shaped the pre-war purge now operated in wartime conditions, influencing how responsibility for losses was assigned. For the German leadership, the early results appeared to confirm pre-war estimates that Soviet aviation was vulnerable. Large numbers of destroyed Soviet aircraft, captured airfields, and disrupted command posts supported the view that the VVS had been effectively neutralized as an offensive instrument, although German planners were aware that Soviet industry could replace losses over time. For Soviet leaders, the same data pointed in another direction. They saw the need for further mobilization of resources and restructuring of command, but interpreted the scale of losses partly through the lens of pre-existing suspicions about professionalism and loyalty within the Air Force. The months after the first shock of June 1941 forced both Soviet and German air forces to adapt to a new reality on the Eastern Front. For the VVS, resistance began with survival. Orders from the General Staff and the newly formed Stavka required rapid dispersal of aircraft, construction of improvised airstrips east of the Dnieper and the western Dvina, and stricter camouflage measures. Regiments split their squadrons between several fields, parked aircraft in tree lines, and dug in fuel and ammunition depots. Where possible, command posts were moved away from obvious rail and road junctions that had been targeted in the first days. Reorganization accompanied these emergency measures. During summer and autumn 1941, air units were reassigned from border districts to fronts that matched the evolving ground situation, such as the Western, Northwestern, and Southwestern fronts. Within these fronts, aviation was grouped into mixed divisions and later into air armies. The aim was to give front commanders integrated control over fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance units supporting their sector. In parallel, separate air defense formations were strengthened around Moscow, Leningrad, and industrial regions on the Volga and in the Urals, using fighter regiments and anti-aircraft artillery coordinated by radar and sound detection posts where available. Training and replacement systems had to be redesigned under wartime conditions. Pre-war flight schools accelerated their programs, reducing the number of training hours per pilot while increasing throughput. New training centers were established in the interior, further from the front. Experienced frontline pilots rotated briefly to instruct courses on combat tactics, navigation and gunnery before returning to their regiments. The result was a growing flow of new pilots to the fronts, but with uneven preparation. Many arrived with limited experience in instrument flying or formation maneuvers and learned practical skills in combat. Tactical adaptation took place at squadron level. Early in the campaign, many VVS units flew in dense formations designed for parade and peacetime exercises. Encounters with German fighter sweeps and bomber formations led to adjustments. Fighter units began to adopt looser pair-based tactics, with one pilot acting as leader and the second as cover, allowing better mutual support and maneuverability. Bomber regiments experimented with lower altitude attacks against columns and bridges, accepting higher exposure to anti-aircraft fire in exchange for greater accuracy. Some long-range aviation units shifted from daylight to night raids to reduce losses at the cost of bomb pattern dispersion. Material changes also shaped adaptation. As 1941 progressed, a growing share of surviving and newly formed regiments received modern fighters and bombers from Soviet factories that had been evacuated eastward. MiG-3, Yak-1, Lei-GG-3 and P-2. Aircraft appeared in increasing numbers, although technical issues and shortages of spare parts persisted. British-supplied Hurricane fighters and later American types such as P-40 and P-39 arrived under Lend-Lease agreements and were allocated primarily to air defense and some frontline units. Pilots and technicians had to learn new cockpit layouts, armament systems, and maintenance procedures while continuing operations. On the German side, adaptation followed a different trajectory. Initial success in destroying Soviet aircraft on the ground could not be repeated indefinitely once the WWII dispersed and camouflaged its units. As German ground forces advanced hundreds of kilometers, Luftwaffe formations had to operate from forward airfields with extended supply lines. Maintenance detachments faced wear on engines and airframes from sustained operations over long distances and in harsh seasons. Commanders redistributed bomber and dive bomber groups between army groups as priorities shifted, while also transferring some units to other theatres, including North Africa and the Balkans. Tactically, German air units refined their methods against emerging Soviet patterns. Fighter groups continued to rely on flexible pairs and fours, but increasingly encountered Soviet pilots who had adjusted their own formations. Bomber crews flying Ju-80s, He-111s and other types had to contend with denser Soviet anti-aircraft fire around key nodes and with the appearance of better organised fighter opposition near Moscow and Leningrad. In some sectors, Luftwaffe units began to focus more on close air support for defensive operations, striking Soviet tank concentrations and artillery positions during counter-offensives in late 1941 and 1942. For those on the ground, adaptation meant changes in daily experience. Soviet ground troops became accustomed to constructing shelters, trenches, and covered vehicle parks to reduce vulnerability to air attack. Civilians in cities such as Moscow and Leningrad participated in blackout measures, camouflage painting of roofs and streets, and the creation of decoy sites. In German-occupied territories, local populations saw both German and Soviet aircraft overhead at different phases of the front, as raids on rail lines and supply depots became more frequent. Psychologically, the prolonged air campaign imposed cumulative pressure. Soviet pilots who had survived the first months carried the memory of heavy losses, but also of gradual improvement in coordination and equipment. German crews confronted increasing flight hours and exposure as the front widened and opposition intensified. Both sides attempted to sustain morale through recognition of successful sorties, unit distinctions and rotation between quieter and more active sectors, while the overall scale of the conflict continued to grow toward the decisive battles of 1942 and 1943. The turning point in the air war on the Eastern Front emerged gradually rather than through a single decision. By late 1942, The balance of resources, experience, and leadership had begun to shift. Soviet aircraft production, dispersed and expanded after the evacuation of factories, started to outpace German output. Newer fighters such as Yak-1, Yak-7, La-5 and upgraded versions of earlier types entered service in growing numbers, while P-2 and Il-2 formations increased their presence at the fronts. At the same time, the Luftwaffe faced rising commitments in North Africa, the Mediterranean and Western Europe, reducing the proportion of forces available for sustained operations in the East. Inside the Soviet system, the leadership drew lessons from the disasters of 1941. Investigations into the early defeats led to the arrest and trial of several front and army commanders. Yet over time, the focus moved from identifying alleged conspirators to improving command structures. The creation of dedicated air armies under front commands, the consolidation of air defense into a unified system, and the clearer division between front aviation, long-range aviation, and air defense aviation gave the VVS a more coherent organizational framework. Commanders who had survived the Purge and the first year of war accumulated practical experience and developed working relationships with ground commanders. The battles around Moscow in late 1941 and early 1942 marked the first large-scale defensive success in which Soviet aviation played a significant role. Fighter regiments concentrated to protect the capital and its approaches, supported by radar and observer networks. Although losses remained high, the ability to maintain regular patrols and intercept some bomber formations indicated that training, equipment, and coordination had improved since June. The experience of organizing layered defense zones and night fighting techniques became part of the institutional memory of the air defense forces. A more decisive shift occurred with the Stalingrad campaign in 1942 to 1943. Both sides committed substantial air assets to support their ground operations. German formations, including bomber, dive bomber, and fighter units, initially provided intensive support to the Sixth Army, bombing Soviet positions in and around the city and interdicting river crossings. Soviet aviation, operating from increasingly distant airfields and under supply constraints, struggled to match this concentration at first. As the encirclement operation developed, however, the VVS improved its ability to mass aircraft for specific missions, attack German airfields and supply hubs, and contest control of the air over the pocket. At Stalingrad, the consequences of pre-war purges and wartime adaptation intersected. Many of the senior commanders who might have led large formations had been removed, but a new cadre of generals and colonels emerged from regimental and divisional commands. They were products of the system that had replaced the old leadership and had been shaped by continuous combat since 1941. Their decisions reflected both the constraints of earlier purges, which had reduced the pool of experienced staff officers, and the pragmatic lessons learned from repeated engagements with the Luftwaffe. Kursk in summer 1943 represented another key stage in this turning point. In preparation for the German offensive, Soviet planners concentrated several air armies with hundreds of fighters and bombers in the salient and surrounding sectors. They coordinated their deployment with extensive ground-based air defense and pre-planned artillery fire. On the German side, Luftflotte 6 and Luftflotte 4 assembled significant forces of fighters and ground attack aircraft. But the numerical relation was no longer as favorable as in 1941. The Luftwaffe still had advantages in pilot experience in some units, yet faced growing shortages of fuel and replacement crews. During the Kursk battles, the VVS conducted large-scale sorties aimed at disrupting German armoured spearheads, supplying frontline Soviet units and attacking rail lines in the rear. Losses were high on both sides, but the capacity of the Soviet system to replace aircraft and crews proved greater. The battle showed that Soviet aviation could operate in close coordination with ground forces in both defensive and offensive phases, something that had been only partially achieved in earlier campaigns. For the Luftwaffe, the intensity of operations over Kursk, combined with commitments in other theatres, accelerated the depletion of experienced pilots. Politically, the turning point also entailed a gradual change in how the leadership assessed the Air Force. While security organs continued to monitor officers, mass arrests of aviation commanders on the scale of 1940 to 1941 did not recur. Successes at Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, and later operations created space for acknowledging professional competence as a criterion for promotion. Some commanders who had been removed from posts earlier in the war were reassigned rather than arrested. At the same time, rehabilitation of officers executed or imprisoned during the pre-war purges remained limited and largely postponed until after Stalin's death. For those serving within the VVS, the shift was felt in daily routines and expectations. Training standards slowly increased again as the immediate emergency of 1941 to 1942 gave way to more planned operations. Units developed standing operating procedures for escort missions, ground attack, and air defense. Staff officers compiled detailed after-action reports, comparing tactics and equipment with those of the Luftwaffe and recommending modifications. The memory of the purges remained present in caution toward political questions, but practical experience and growing material resources gave commanders more room to concentrate on operational tasks. From the German perspective, the turning point in the air war was visible in the gradual loss of air superiority over key sectors of the Eastern Front. After 1943, Luftwaffe units often had to prioritize urgent ground support or defensive tasks rather than free-ranging interdiction missions. The need to defend German cities against Allied bombing further reduced the aircraft and pilots available in the East. The cumulative effects of attrition, extended supply lines, and multi-front obligations meant that the advantage created partly by the earlier Soviet purge of its own Air Force leadership could no longer be maintained. By 1944, the air war over the Eastern Front was moving steadily westward. Soviet offensives in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics pushed German ground forces back toward pre-war borders, and air units followed. VVS air armies supported large-scale operations such as the Lvov-Sandomierz, Vistula-Oder, and East Prussian offensives with thousands of sorties per day, bombing rail junctions, bridges, and defensive positions. In many sectors, Soviet fighters and attack aircraft operated with relative freedom at medium and low altitudes, a contrast to the conditions of 1941 when German formations had dominated the airspace over Soviet territory. For the Luftwaffe, this phase meant a combination of retreat and concentrated defensive efforts. As German forces withdrew from Ukraine and Belarus, air units attempted to cover crossings over major rivers and to support rearguard actions. Supply shortages increasingly limited the number of daily sorties, especially for bomber and ground attack units that required large amounts of aviation fuel. In encircled or isolated areas, such as the Courland Pocket and parts of East Prussia, German transport and bomber aircraft conducted evacuation flights for troops and civilians, but could not prevent the gradual reduction of usable airfields and infrastructure. Civilian populations along the retreat and advance routes experienced the concluding phase of the air war through renewed bombing of transport nodes and urban areas. Soviet aircraft attacked stations, ports, and columns in regions that had previously been under German occupation, while German raids continued against some Soviet-held cities and lines of communication. In East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, refugee movements toward the west were exposed to air attack at road and rail bottlenecks. In formerly occupied Soviet territories, returning civilians encountered airfields littered with wrecked aircraft and unexploded ordnance, as well as damaged industrial sites linked to aviation production and repair. When Germany capitulated in May 1945, combat operations of the VVS in Europe ended, although some units soon redeployed to the Far East for operations against Japan. Demobilization began gradually. Air armies were reduced, some regiments disbanded, and aircraft placed in storage or scrapped. Training establishments adjusted their curricula from wartime acceleration to more systematic peacetime programs, while incorporating combat experience into manuals. The organizational framework created during the war, with air armies and centralized air defense, remained and formed the basis for the post-war Soviet Air Force and air defense forces. In the immediate aftermath, Soviet authorities conducted investigations into the early defeats of 1941 and the conduct of operations throughout the war. Official wartime histories and post-war analyses emphasized the role of industrial relocation, improved organization, and the heroism of personnel in overcoming the initial crisis. Discussion of the pre-war purges appeared mainly in classified reports, often framed in terms of necessary security measures rather than as a central cause of military failures. Within the Air Force, reference to purged commanders and engineers was limited in official publications, even when their earlier work on doctrine or technology had shaped capabilities. The individual fate of many Air Force leaders arrested before and during the war was final. Smushkevich, Rychagov, Loktionov and others were executed in 1941. Some officers and engineers arrested in connection with alleged conspiracies in the aviation industry died in labor camps. A smaller number survived imprisonment or exile and returned to civilian life or technical work after the change in political climate following Stalin's death. In the mid-1950s, commissions reviewed numerous cases, and many of those shot or imprisoned in 1937 to 1941 were posthumously rehabilitated, their sentences annulled, and their names restored in official records, though often without full public discussion of the circumstances. For surviving pilots and commanders who had served through the war, the legacy of the pre-war purges and early losses was mixed. Some had benefited from a rapid promotion when senior posts were vacated. They then had to carry responsibility during the most difficult phases of the conflict. Others had lost mentors, colleagues or family members to arrests and executions. In post-war memoirs and interviews, references to these experiences were cautious or absent during the Stalin period, then became more frequent in later decades when restrictions on public discussion eased. In neighboring states and among foreign observers, the end of the war prompted assessments of how the Soviet Air Force had changed since the 1930s. Analysts compared its 1941 performance, marked by heavy losses and disrupted command, with its role in large offensive operations in 1944 to 1945. Many concluded that industrial capacity and organizational adaptation had compensated for, but not erased, the effects of earlier internal repression. For local populations in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, however, the dominant memory of the air war remained the tangible impact of bombing, evacuation, and reconstruction, rather than the internal dynamics of command and purges within the VVS. In the decades after 1945, the destruction of the pre-war Soviet Air Force leadership became a subject of analysis for military historians, former officers, and foreign observers. At the center of their discussion stood a basic question: to what extent did the purges of 1937 to 1941 represent a self-inflicted wound that shaped the first phase of the war? The evidence combined quantitative data on arrests and executions with qualitative assessments of doctrine, training and command decisions before June 1941 and in the first weeks of the campaign. One line of interpretation emphasizes continuity of institutional development despite repression. According to this view, industrial growth, mass training, and the introduction of new aircraft types created objective strengths that partly offset the loss of experienced commanders and engineers. The rapid mobilization of resources after the invasion, the reorganization into air armies, and the eventual achievement of air superiority over the Eastern Front are cited as indicators that the system, although damaged, retained the capacity to adapt. Proponents of this perspective also point to other factors in the 1941 defeats, including surprise, German operational experience, and weaknesses in ground force deployment. Another approach places the purges at the core of the explanation for early Luftwaffe dominance. Here, the comparison between the VVS command structure of 1936 and that of June 1941 is central. The removal and execution of figures such as Alksny's, Smushkevich, and their staff officers, many with combat experience in Spain or at Khalkhin Gol, are seen as breaking the continuity of doctrinal debate and staff work. Frequent changes in command posts, the climate of fear created by NKVD investigations, and the use of political criteria for promotion are presented as obstacles to systematic training and realistic assessment of equipment and tactics. Within this framework, the first week of Barbarossa appears as the operational manifestation of these processes. German destruction of large numbers of Soviet aircraft on the ground, the disruption of communications, and the difficulty of coordinating fighter and bomber operations are interpreted not only as the result of surprise and technical factors, but also as symptoms of a leadership corps that had been repeatedly reshaped and constrained. The absence of some experienced Spanish Civil War veterans and senior planners, arrested or executed shortly before the invasion, is presented as one element in a broader pattern of disrupted preparation. Soviet and later Russian historiography has reflected these tensions. Official works published during the Stalin era and shortly thereafter stressed industrial achievements and the learning curve of the armed forces, while treating the purges cautiously or omitting them. From the late 1980s onward, archival releases allowed researchers to trace individual cases of aviators listed in NKVD arrest documents and to reconstruct the careers of commanders removed between 1937 and 1941. These studies confirmed the scale of repression in aviation circles, but also revealed the complexity of individual biographies, which included both professional achievements and involvement in political structures. Outside the Soviet Union, the Air Force purge became part of broader assessments of Stalinist policy. Some analysts treated it as a strategic miscalculation that temporarily increased the relative advantage of the Luftwaffe in 1941. Others warned against monocausal explanations, arguing that even without the purges, the Soviet Union would have faced serious challenges in integrating rapid technological change, mass conscription, and complex command structures. Comparative studies with other air forces highlighted that many states struggled with doctrine and training in the transition from biplane to monoplane fighters, from light bombers to twin-engine medium bombers, and from visual to radio-based navigation. For participants, the legacy remained personal as well as institutional. Pilots and technicians who entered service after 1937 often experienced the purge indirectly through the disappearance of instructors or the absence of certain names from official histories. Those who had known arrested colleagues carried memories that could only be expressed in limited circles during the Stalin period. After rehabilitation processes in the 1950s and later, families of executed officers received formal recognition that sentences had been unjustified, but full public discussion of the impact on military effectiveness developed gradually. In contemporary analysis, the Air Force purge is often situated within a wider pattern of state behavior in which security priorities and political control intersected with military planning. The destruction of experienced cadres reduced the pool of expertise available for preparing the air arm for a complex, high-intensity conflict. At the same time, the scale of Soviet industrial mobilization and the capacity to generate new leadership under fire contributed to eventual success. The interaction of these elements illustrates how internal political decisions can influence military performance over both short and long horizons. The case of the VVS between 1937 and 1941 thus continues to inform broader debates on civil-military relations, organizational resilience, and the risks associated with frequent leadership turnover driven by political criteria. It shows how decisions taken in a period of relative peace such as the restructuring of command and the persecution of certain professional groups, can shape outcomes years later when institutions are subjected to extreme external pressure. For scholars and practitioners alike, the history of the Soviet Air Force purge remains a detailed example of how preparation, policy, and war are interconnected.